What's up everybody, it's guubums back with another comps video. Today I'm going to be focusing on reroll. I know the patch has been out for a week. Unfortunately I was on vacation so I couldn't really get the video out before then. That being said, it's a very big patch, so there's going to be a lot of new comps, a lot of kind of like different faces that you guys aren't too used to seeing. And I did decide that for this patch I'll be splitting the comps video into reroll and kind of like forecast comps. And I do know I kind of say this a lot where I put out like a reroll video or I put out like comps video and I say the other one is coming, but this time it's actually coming. So yeah, look out for that. It's probably going to come out either in the next couple of hours or probably within the next day. I do have tourneys to prep for, so it is important that I'm confident in the comps that I'm playing. And I think because we've been given a week for the meta to settle, I think this time around I'm a lot more confident in what I'm recommending. That being said, most of the time I am recommending generally the top comps, but as the meta develops, you'll see a couple comps here and there. For example, in one of the most recent patches, I didn't actually recommend Vex just because at the time I made the video, the comp hadn't really blossomed yet. So I think this time around, we're definitely not going to be caught with too many surprises. Again, it is a big patch, so there are going to be a lot of new faces. And yeah, without further ado, let's get into it. The very first comp I have for you guys today is just Morgana Bastion's reroll. This is going to be a comp that you guys have probably seen a decent amount on ladder already, just because I believe there was either a Twitter guide or a Reddit guide or some sort of guide that came out that kind of like really got people into it. It happens to be a very straightforward comp, as well as a comp that is kind of shares a lot of similarities with a lot of comps in previous sets that people will be familiar with, say like Malzahar reroll or Cassiopeia reroll in their respective sets. I don't remember exactly which ones. I believe it's like set 6 and set 9, I want to say, but it's not too clear for me. But yeah, it's just your standard kind of like damage over time blue buff building comp that you guys have probably seen before, and it is very strong. So yeah, let's get into it. So the very first thing I want to talk about is like the situation in which you play this comp. Granted, it's a one cost reroll comp, so it tends to be fairly obvious just because it is really dependent on kind of like the units and the items you get on stage 1. So on stage 1, like say you have a Morgana 2 and like a Poppy pair, you can already start to look at this comp. I think for the most part, you want to be thinking about this comp generally when you have a tier, just because that blue buff is going to be really important, which I'm sure you guys will see in either this video or the next video, that there's going to be a lot of champs and a lot of comps that are really reliant on that blue buff. So a lot of these comps are going to be pretty tier reliant. And most of the time when you're playing this comp, you kind of want to lose those first 3 rounds so that you have carousel priority on stage 2, which will allow you to have access to at least a 50-50 to get a tier. And obviously, sometimes it'll be better because the other person that is picking with you won't want a tier. So yeah, this comp, very straightforward. For itemization, you're really just looking for like generic tank items on Poppy and then blue buff Gunblade on Morgana. Something to kind of like keep in mind is that there are some serious big kind of like opportunities you can use with this comp to like truly buff up its power when you get Bastion Spat or Blinding Jewel on Morgana. In those cases, you still pretty much want to be building Blue Gunblade. In the case where you have both, you drop Gunblade, but for the most part, it's really difficult to find a situation where you have both. So just for the most part, you're looking for blue buff Gunblade +1. The third item is generally a damage item. Death Cap tends to be the best one. Or Archangel is good. Giant Slayer, Guardbreaker, all your classic damage items that I've talked about many times in the past. As per usual, you definitely want anti-heal and you definitely want Shred. In this comp specifically, Shred is best in the form of Shiv. That being said, obviously your blue buff needs to get built with a lot of urgency, so it's really difficult to find yourself with a third tier to build that Shiv for like a lot of the game. So you end up having to build Spark a lot of the time. Spark is not bad, there's nothing wrong with Spark, but the reason why Shiv is very important in this comp as opposed to other kind of AP comps is for what I'm about to tell you, which is about kind of like the positioning in this comp a little bit. So this comp actually pressures the backline really heavily, and what I mean by that is that the way Morgana works is that her spell fires at like the unit you're targeting, or I believe it's nearest enemy maybe, and then it fires off an extra bullet or missile towards a nearby enemy and does damage over a certain amount of time. And that combos really well with Poppy, who fires her buckler or whatever in within 3 hexes, and I believe, well, not I believe. Poppy can actually target enemy backliners with that, with her ability. And if you know anything about Poppy, is that her ability scales with her resistances, the damage. And pretty much what happens is that, say the enemy carry is just like here, let's just put a Morgana here, is over here, then Poppy's actually just going to throw her buckler over at Morgana a lot of the time in either of these two positions. Both are fine. but you are targeting the enemy carry with her ability. And with that, the Shiv, as I was mentioning earlier, obviously you're doing some chip damage to the back. Morello, same idea. Obviously, eventually, Morello will make it onto Aurora, but I'll talk about that in a second. And then pretty much there's going to be a lot of chip damage onto the enemy backliner combined with Morgana that will kill their carry pretty early into a fight. So oftentimes you'll see carries, even if they have something like a Gunblade, so you'll see like Aphelios's and maybe Zeres with Gunblade, even through healing, oftentimes they're actually just going to die to the abilities just because like the amount of chip damage that's like they're being affected by. It is a little bit tougher with Zeri because she moves around, so it's tough for Poppy to kind of like snipe her just because Poppy's ability is a controlled spell, meaning that like it is consistently kind of like hitting the same units, and because Zeri's moving around all the place, depending on her positioning and when your Poppy has the mana to cast, it's obviously not going to hit. Granted, that's like a pretty niche scenario, but I figured it's worth mentioning. Yeah, that's like a basic kind of like tip with this comp is that obviously on this side, it's the same idea. You would just be targeting the enemy left corner. So there's a little bit of positioning nuance with this. As per usual, eventually you will be playing Sedge. So Sedge also has the same idea. Like you generally want that Sedge in front of the enemy carries, generally in the Hex on the front line, one off from the corner. So you don't really want it where Galio is, and you don't really want it here, but you want it here and here most of the time. So there is going to be a little bit of a difference between how this comp, the strength of this comp, depending on the positioning you get it versus your opponent. But for the most part, you kind of just want to keep Poppy towards the edges of your front line and your Morgana on the same side. Elise, you want to also be putting on the similar side as Morgana, just because Elise's ability shreds MR a little bit or reduces MR, slightly different than shred. I know a lot of people, this is like a concept that actually confuses a lot of people just because it's a flat reduction versus like Shiv and Spark, which is a percentage reduction. And those two reductions actually stack in a very favorable way for you. And what I mean by that is that it goes percentage first. So say they have 100 armor, sorry, in this case MR. It'll go from 100 to 70 from the Spark and the Shiv. And then from 70, it'll drop by 5. So versus the other way where if you went from 100 to like say 95, then 30% of 95 is going to be less than 30, right? And then the net loss of their MR is actually going to be pretty much granted to you in the most favorable way. Yeah, there's not too many augments I want to talk about with this comp just because like it's really straightforward actually. I put, your basic reroll augment, like, Starry Night happens to be very, very strong with this comp because you are going for a couple of low cost 3 stars, namely Morgana, Poppy, being the main ones. I do think it is something to go for Jax. That being said, like Jax is pretty ineffective just as a unit, honestly. So it's not really all that important to get a Jax 3, but sometimes you will have Jax 3. I wouldn't commit much more than a Thieves Claws because ultimately your tank items, it's like say you have extra tank items outside of your 3-item Poppy, ultimately they're just going to be better on Sejuani. So it doesn't really make sense to commit too many items to a Jax that doesn't really do all that much tanking and certainly doesn't do any damage at all. That being said, it is a really cheap 3-star to go for, and it certainly doesn't make you weaker. So if you happen to be able to get a lot of Jaxes, it is going to be quite valuable. Also, another thing is that like obviously this comp is not going to be that strong until you have 3 stars. Poppy 2 is actually notoriously really, really bad as a unit. It doesn't really do much. So the interaction I was kind of like mentioning earlier where you're like sniping the enemy carries is not really all that viable to rely on if you have a Poppy 2. And the reason for that is just because Poppy won't be getting more than 1 cast, whereas when you're getting to 3 stars, she's getting like 4, 5, 6 casts even sometimes, right? And then it's doing a lot more damage, and ultimately you're just going to be able to kill the enemy carry. So sometimes if you have a Jax 3 before you have Poppy 3, then you can itemize the Jax just for a frontliner, but ultimately you're always going to be moving items onto your Poppy. And this is one of those comps where your Poppy 3 actually matters almost just as much as your Morgana 3. Pretty much just for the interaction I was talking about earlier. But yeah, it's not one of those comps where, oh, I'm just gonna hit Morgana 3 and push. That being said, like in some rare scenarios, say like Build a Bud or maybe Pandora's Bench, there are some scenarios where you actually just get like 3 Morganas right away. And in those scenarios, you can probably push. But the interesting part about those scenarios is that Morgana 3 is played in so many comps, such as like say Vex, and later on you'll see in this video I'm going to be talking about Elise reroll. It's played in so many of these comps as a splash unit that if you happen to have a 3-star without being able to go for Poppy 3, you can actually find yourself in a scenario where you don't really play around Morgana main carry, right? Like Morgana will get some items, but you don't want to like pour all your resources into her just because at that point, if you can kind of like push levels, then you can scale into level 8, level 9 and kind of like do more that way. But yeah, that's basic stuff for augments. And finally, how do you cap out with this comp? So you do want to be able to rush Morgana with 6 Bastions as soon as possible. And again, the reason for that is because of how Poppy interacts with resists, right? So the sooner you get 6 Bastion, not only is your team tankier, but your Poppy's actually doing much more damage to the backliners. And as I mentioned earlier, that interaction is extremely important. So you do want to be capping around 6 Bastion for most of the game. So your level 8 will generally look like Morgana plus a Dynamo plus 6 Bastions. Obviously, if you have, in the case that you have a Bastion Spat or Morgana, then you get to play an extra Dynamo. As you scale up, you just want to be playing more and more Dynamos. And it's a really simple stuff. Like, obviously, as you get to level 8 and level 9, Sejuani, Renekton, and Aurora become very valuable. They actually just buffed Renekton, so itemizing him doesn't feel nearly as bad as it did in the previous patches. His standard, like, quote-unquote bis is going to be something along the lines of Sterax, QSS plus, like, +1, I don't know, GA, Titans. All the melee items are generally pretty good. GS, just any damage item also happens to be fine on him. And you don't want to eat a backliner, you just want to eat one of your frontliners. In the case you have Jax 3, I would almost certainly eat Jax 3 just for the health pool. It's much more useful on Renekton. And yeah, otherwise you're just capping around Aurora. Eventually, if you get an Aurora 2, obviously you're going to move your Elise items over to Aurora. But part of the beauty of this comp is how strong Elise 2 is. So in the mid game, when you're kind of like scaling up and say you have 2 Dynamo, 4 Bastion, your Elise 2 is actually going to be pumping a lot of damage. And by a lot of damage, I mean, like, in a lot of fights, you will actually see her damaging your Morgana, even with scuffed items. Just because part of the strength of Morgana is the fact of, like, how she targets, as well as using Gunblade to heal your team. And the longer the fight goes, obviously Morgana is going to do more damage. But Elise really pumps right now, especially after the buffs, which is why, again, later on into the video, you guys are going to see some comps that are focused around Elise. But yeah, that's pretty much it for this comp, and on to the next one. Next one we have Shaco Reroll. So Shaco Reroll is a little bit of an interesting one just because there's actually a big difference in the situations in which you play Shaco. I think for the most part, you should never play Shaco Reroll without, at the bare minimum, 2 Shacos onto one, but me personally, I would never play it without at least 3 Shacos, and chances are I'm not playing it without 4 Shacos unless I have a very specific reason to do so. And one of such specific reasons is ranged Shaco. So I'll talk about like the standard comp in just a little bit, but I think ranged Shaco is such like it's almost like a hero augment in the sense that like it's so impactful to the power of Shaco, and it's played so differently that I have to mention it almost like separate from the standard Shaco comp. So ranged Shaco just pretty much means you have a ranged item on him. There's a couple artifacts that do it. Sniper's Focus is not quite good enough, but Fishbones and RFC are. So Fishbones, Rapid, I believe is Rapid Fire Cannon are going to be really good on him, and the last one is going to be Scope Weapons. These items and situations change the way you play Shaco drastically. So normally when you're playing Shaco, he's kind of like an assassin, kind of like jumps on your carries a little bit. Eventually you're playing around Zed, so like between Zed and Shaco, you win fights by kind of assassinating their carry. When you have range Shaco, he becomes your standard, attack speed AD carry, right? Like in the same way Aphelios, and maybe like some other comps like Zeri in the past are. And in those cases, when you have range Shaco, you actually want to be building Rage Blade. So Rage Blade on your standard Shaco is completely useless. You're actually going to be losing items. In fact, it's useless on Senna as well, so don't be building Rage Blade if you don't have range Shaco. But if you have range Shaco, then you go Rage Blade +1. Most of the time, Giant Slayer is going to be the best one you can get. But it doesn't really matter all too much what your last item is. I believe Giant Slayer and Hurricane are going to be the 2 best, just because of the amount of AD Shaco has, and Hurricane ends up being the best AD scaling item in the game in terms of pure DPS. The argument against building Hurricane is the fact that Hurricane bolts don't proc Slayer Omnivamp. So I actually argue that Hurricane's already close to best in slot on a melee Shaco. But again, because that Hurricane doesn't actually heal Shaco off of the bolts from Slayer, then the value actually goes down, and you generally just want something like Giant Slayer instead. But I would say don't be afraid to put Hurricane on a melee Shaco, especially in the early game, just to kind of get some stacks going. It is a really strong item that can eventually be transferred to your Senna anyway, but yeah, just a little bit of extra stuff. All right, moving on from range Shaco, we're going to talk about... Actually, no, there's one more thing I have to talk about with range Shaco, and that is the standard board for the Shaco is going to be 3 Syndicate, 6 Slayer on 8, which is the board you see in the picture. But with range Shaco, you actually don't want to be playing Syndicate, because you don't actually want your Shaco jumping around. It doesn't make sense for him to jump around. Like, it's the same idea, right? Like I was talking about Zarya and Aphelios. Like, do you really want your Zarya and Aphelios kind of like jumping into the enemy team? Absolutely not. So in those cases, you don't actually need to play Syndicate. It's still fine to play 3 Syndicate just for stats, and like say you have like a tanky Braum, you can have the Braum, but for the most part, I wouldn't really think about it too much. You just drop these, so you're playing range Shaco. you're still playing 6 layers, but like you can start playing some Divinicores or just like any value units such as 5 costs that you can kind of like get your hands on, right? All right, enough about range Shaco. We're going to be talking about melee Shaco. So melee Shaco again is going to be a comp that you really want to be playing if you have many copies on stage one, and you generally want to have like a sword, bow, or glove, something along those lines, some of those AD items before you really commit to it. Shaco 2 with like a Mundo 2 on stage 2 with like a random bruiser is likely to be able to get you a couple rounds. Even though obviously with 1 cost reroll comps you generally have to stay under leveled because you have to roll on 4 on 3-1. So you generally want to just slow roll on 5. It's not something I mentioned for, I guess, the Morgana comp, but yeah, this is a comp that you want to slow roll on 5-4, generally mostly through stage 5, or sorry, stage 3, while you don't pump a single time. And then on 3-1, which is after Krugs, you want to roll to around 33 gold. The exact explanation for why you roll to 33 gold is a little bit complex, but pretty much all you need to know is that that's 33 gold is the mathematically correct amount to roll to. And then you just stop. Obviously, again, you're just pretty much looking for Shaco in this comp. So unlike the other comp, you're not actually rolling for multiple 3 stars. In the case that you have a million Mundos, obviously you can just go for Mundo 3 and like he'll be able to do something, but it's not something that's really important to this comp in the same way something like the Poppy is for the previous comp. There's a misconception about Shaco best in slot items that I don't really know where it came from, but people seem to really love like going like BTIE on him or like Titans. Pretty much all 3 of those items are really quite bad on him. Shaco True Bis on a melee is QSS, Edge of Night, and Giant Slayer. I don't know who told people Infinity Edge is good. I know Dish Soap once mentioned Infinity Edge, but I think at this point we've realized that Infinity Edge is not going to be that good. Obviously, that doesn't mean Dish Soap was wrong in saying what he said. It just means that like we have developed past that a little bit. And you pretty much just want to go double defensive with no healing. And the reason for that is because Shaco will pretty much heal to full so long as he has uptime. And what I mean by uptime is just the amount of times he can auto, or like the amount of time he spends continuously autoing. And that's going to be why like range Shaco is good, because his passive allows him to build up a bunch of AD, but it also gives him a lot of uptime, right? Like he's always going to be auto attacking and it's always going to be pumping out that damage. And the best way to kind of maximize a melee Shaco's uptime is to build QSS and Edge of Night. Edge of Night obviously is going to be important because on most melee carries in the game, Edge of Night just ends up being the best item because that aggro drop is extremely, extremely powerful. There's a lot of single target units in the game, such as like Zeri, Aphelios, Urgot, that when they get on your melee carry, they pretty much will just one-shot your carry. And obviously Edge of Night prevents against that. QSS obviously helps with not only just the attack speed it gives, which is actually really, really dramatic. It ends up being better than Rageblade for a large portion of the fight. But not only just that, it gives you, again, more uptime because when you get CC'd, you're immune to it, right? So you're going to be healing through that, and you don't really want to end up building BT just because 6 layer gives you so much lifesteal already, 20%, that you just want to be building more damage, right? Shaco's ability will just one-shot with or without IE, and the bulk of Shaco's damage doesn't actually come from his ability, which is why earlier when I was talking about IE, I mentioned how it's not going to be the best item on him. The reason, like, for IE to be quote-unquote, like, best in slot on a unit, it means that the spell of that unit has to be doing the majority of their damage. So the reason why you don't really build IE on Zeri all too often is because the majority of her damage is really just coming from pure auto attacks. Yes, her spell does crit if you have IE, and like it does make up a portion of her damage that's not insignificant. At the end of the day, it's just her auto attacks that do damage. Same idea for Senna and Aphelios. IE ends up being quite good on all of these units. It just isn't going to be the one of the best 3 items. Like Aphelios, I believe, is going to be double Rageblade Gunblade, or like Rageblade Gunblade +1. Zeri is going to be like one of the EXO items plus Rageblade plus like Giant Slayer or something like that. Shaco, same idea, right? We're just gonna have to build GS ideally. Deathblade ends up being really good, even though you have a lot of AD, just because the damage amp is just better. And obviously, Deathblade is gonna be something that's gonna be tough to come by, just because this comp can use swords everywhere. So it doesn't really make all too much sense to build a Deathblade on Shaco, just because, say I have 2 swords, I'd much rather build like a Giant Slayer on Shaco, and then the second sword ends up being a Z item, right? And then that being said, bows are also hard to come by in this comp just because your Senna ends up holding a lot of your bow components, right? And Senna ends up being your kind of like utility bot. Even though Senna does a lot of damage, she ends up holding your Last Whispers, your red buffs of the world, and like anything that provides shred and anti-heal is always going to be important in a comp, and Senna just happens to be the best holder of it. You can go Even Shroud and Sunfire, but it ends up not being all too valuable just because the tankiest unit you have on your team is going to be something like a J4. But ultimately, J4 is not that tanky, right? Compared to like in other comps, you're going to have like a real main tank, say like a Sejuani, a Leona, something like that. J4 isn't that, right? Like you're not going for J4 3 and he's not going to be that tanky. So Even Shroud ends up being worse. And Sunfire in general is just going to be worse than Red Buff anyway, Red Buff Morello anyway. And it's an early game slam. But the thing is, it doesn't make sense to slam Sunfire in the early game for this comp just because it's really tough to like guarantee that you're going to win a lot of rounds with this comp because as for most one cost rerolls, it's going to be a comp that you're kind of like staying low level on, and relative to the people that you're fighting against, you're going to be down a unit, right? So yeah, I guess like a small tip is just you can put Even Shroud on Zed and it's really quite good. It kind of just behaves like a Lost Whisper. It gives him some tank stats. Tank stats on Zed are perfectly acceptable. So after your Shaco items, which we already talked about, your Senna items, you're going to be building around Zed items. You do want to cap around Zed too. And ultimately on 9, you're just going to be playing another 5 costs most of the time. But I think in the case that you can get a second Z2, it's actually like better than most of the 5 costs. Just because the type of damage Zed does is really complementary with Zed as well as Shaco. So earlier I was mentioning with melee Shaco, he's much more of an assassin, right? So, and like Zed obviously is also an assassin. So when you have more assassins, you're putting a lot more pressure on the enemy carries. And even if they, for example, kind of like dodge you by being on the opposite side, then obviously if you have 2 assassins, then they're going to get pressured a lot harder. And the way Shaco works is he's targeting low health units. So low health units, you obviously don't actually have backline access with the rest of your team, right? You don't have a brand or anything like that. But Zed is the way you kind of like get access to those backlines, and then Shaco will just zip to them, one-shot them, and you'll be good to go. This comp, I would say, most of the time doesn't win just because there's not too many opportunities to kind of like play around a 5 cost, unlike some of the other comps. But I do think this comp is a really, really strong top 4 comp. And again, if you get a range Shaco setup, then it is played differently. But in those cases, you are very likely to be able to win. Another thing to mention is that Shaco 3 early is extremely powerful. So there are going to be some games where on stage 1 you have like 6 Shacos, and you play Shaco, you hit a Shaco 3 on stage 2 or really early on stage 3, right? And he's going to start building up those stacks, and it's going to be insane. Finally, I think no, I was gonna talk about this blue buff Zed because it is on the screen and like I'm sure I'm gonna get questions about it. I think blue buff Zed really is his best in slot. It's gonna be like blue buff GS +1, probably Edge of Night, but like I actually prefer to go slightly more damage and just go like a Deathblade or IE instead. And the reason why blue buff Zed is so good is just because his first cast actually ends up being pretty important because you really want to get the ball rolling quick on Zed. Like Zed dashes, also positioning on Zed also matters. So you generally want it in these 2 slots, just because that's how you target the enemy corner carries. Putting in the middle means you pretty much never dash to the carry. But anyways, yeah, about blue buff, you dash to the carry right away, and then the more you zip around, like Zed is just a caster. He's not an auto attacker. So, like in this case, like IE ends up being really, really good. But you don't really want Zed to spend a lot of time on the front line. You want him to just start zipping to the back line immediately. And because Zed breaks aggro on his cast, the more casts he gets, it kind of like makes the enemy carries really dizzy, in that like they'll be attacking you, and then like you'll zip around, and then like they won't be attacking you anymore, and like they won't really get anything going. And yeah, blue buff Zed is really good. But this is like kind of a lot to talk about for such a straightforward comp. Very straightforward. I think you should play it if you get the spot. And yeah. Next up, we have Cypher Reroll. So they just buffed 5 Cypher to give 70 AD after you cash out. And what that means is that all the units that you have that are Cypher are going to be getting a ton of stats, right? And this comp is going to be really awkward. It's tough for me to explain exactly how to play it just because I've only played it a handful of times myself. I believe I only played it like 2 or 3 times, and then watched maybe like a couple times like other pros play it. And yeah, it's a little bit interesting, right? So when you play reroll comps, most of the time it's going to be from loss streak just because you have to stay low level, and then you kind of like spend all your gold a little bit earlier than other comps. So say on 3-2 or 3-5, depending on which level you're rolling on, you're going to roll for your 2 stars to kind of like stabilize your board so that you can go for 3 stars later, right? And the thing with this comp is that because Cypher is a loss streak trait, it's a little bit more difficult to do that. So most of the time when people play Cypher, they're playing it until stage 4. But then if you get your 2 stars on stage 4 after cashing out your Cypher, and you're still playing for Cypher reroll, it is going to be a little bit more difficult to stabilize, right? Because LeBlanc 2, Draven 2, Galio 2, at that point in the game is just frankly not going to be that strong, because at that point in the game, people are starting to get their Aphelios 2s, right? Their Zeri 2s, their Vex 2s. And like these things obviously are going to be a lot stronger than your 2-star 3 and 2 costs. That being said, that doesn't actually mean this comp is bad. And a kind of misconception about this comp is the fact that you have to play Lost Streak just because you're playing Cypher. That's not true. So you can actually just win for most of the game. Like say for whatever reason, I'm going to talk about Hostile Takeover in a second, but if for whatever reason in the early game you just happen to be winning a lot of rounds, you could be playing Cypher for the entire game all the way up until probably like 4-3 instead of 4-1, maybe even sometimes 4-7, and you look for a bigger cash out that way instead of just losing all your HP. The issue with doing that is it's going to be difficult to find a balance, just because you actually need to cash out your Cypher to receive the stats from 5 Cypher. So your board strength, like chances are, if you don't cash out 5 Cypher, you're not going to be winning all too many rounds anyway, just because ultimately you're playing a trait that doesn't actually give you any power, right? Like without cashing it out, you're not getting 70 AD, meaning you're playing 5 units that are essentially built different without built different, right? But yeah, on to kind of like talking about the kind of like the nuances of this comp. So personally, I believe EU generally plays around LeBlanc reroll, but having played this comp a couple times, I actually believe that this is one of those comps where you kind of just play it like Twisted Fate, where you go for like sure, you roll for LeBlanc on 6, probably LeBlanc 2, just to like save some HP and maybe kind of like get some kills for your Cypher. And since you're, again, most of the time you're going to be cashing out Cypher on 4-1 anyway, it's fine to delay your spike a little bit. So you can play around a LeBlanc that way. But because you're going to be delaying your spike, there's actually not as much pressure to roll on 3-2. And so if you guys recall in the previous videos when I'm talking about Twisted Fate, you're like pressured heavily to roll on 3-2 because the comp doesn't have any win-out potential and doesn't scale very well. But you kind of like really want to be winning those mid-game fights. However, with this comp, it's different, right? Like your win-out potential is going to be somewhat tied to your cash out, and because you have a cash out, you're always gonna have a chance to win depending on how good your cash out is. So I actually like to play for like a level 7. Ideally, you hit like 1 Z on 7. It's not always going to be possible, but like ideally you can, and then you just play an Echo. You can go for Echo 3, you can not go for Echo 3. Ultimately, Galio 3 is better if you can have access to that. But Echo 3 is just something to roll for alongside your Blanc if you're rolling on 6. And it's also obviously a strategist, so it ends up being quite kind of like fitting. You play Sejuani to pair with your Galio, basic stuff, obviously, as per usual. Renekton also ends up being really good because, again, Cypher gives 70 AD, and Renekton eats a portion of that unit's AD. So if, say, you eat your Zed with, like, a Renekton 2 with your Zed items, like GA and Deathblade or something like that, then your Renekton's just going to tear through the enemy team, and it's almost going to be like if Renekton had Cypher himself. You could actually just also eat the Vi, because same idea, like, Vi actually gets the AD as well. So obviously your Zed ends up being a pretty powerful unit, so if you don't want to like take a big chunk out of his HP, then eating like a Vi is going to be much kind of like safer. So yeah, with this comp, you kind of go 7, and then you're just going to go for as many of these 3 stars as you can. Best in slot for LeBlanc is going to be Shojin Gunblade +1. I think if you're playing the 5 Cypher version, you generally don't need a damage item, just because Cypher gives so much damage. So your third item is ideally a mana item. And I'm counting Nashers as a mana item in this scenario, just because attack speed just ends up being mana in like a roundabout way. So if you go like Shojin Gunblade plus blue buff, adaptive, or Nashers, you're probably good to go. And the reason why you want double mana on LeBlanc is because every time she casts, she gains 1 extra like little missile. And obviously, by the end of a long fight, that missile is going to be like, she's going to be shooting like 12 missiles, right? And then that's essentially doing, close to 3 times more damage per cast compared to early on in the fight. And that's also why Gunblade ends up being really quite powerful, is because you scale so well into the fight that as long as you keep your front line alive, LeBlanc has some natural scaling on her ability that ends up being really, really powerful. Draven, just because you're going to have Draven 2 for longer than you'll have Draven 3 relative to LeBlanc, you're just going to be putting your utility items on him. If you put Red Shiv on Draven, even without like a true damage item like a Giant Slayer or an IE, he's going to be pumping a lot of damage. My Draven 2 was doing close to like 40-ish% of my LeBlanc's damage every single fight, even though he had scuffed items. Like, I think I had double Shiv Draven, right? Like, that's not a real Draven build, but he was still doing a lot of damage, just because ultimately that 70 AD from Cypher is extremely impactful, even if it's on a Draven 2. Galio standard tank items, you want to build a Spark or a Shiv somewhere. Like, obviously, if you have Spark, you don't build Shiv, and vice versa. It's actually completely fine to build an Even Shroud and a Last Whisper in this comp as well, just because you are kind of dual carrying Draven Zed. When you get to level 8, the way to cap out with this comp is actually to play double Z2 if you can, because if one Z is benefiting from my 5 Cypher, why not have two Zs benefiting from 5 Cypher? And yeah, you can play Slayer instead, and ultimately you will just be playing Senna or J4 a lot of the time, just because Slayer is good. But if you happen to have a second Z2, it is really, really strong to be playing that second Z2. This is not something I notice a lot of players doing, even in the comps that it makes sense. Like, a lot of times, one of the best things you can actually just play in a lot of melee comps is a second copy of your main carry. So in this set, there's not too many melee champs, but like Zed, it's very true. I already mentioned in the Shaco build that you want to be playing two Zeds. It's the same idea here. You want to play two Zeds, and ultimately you're just going to be scaling with your standard 5-cost soup to cap. Zac ends up being one of the better ones. You don't actually get too much access to the 5-cost just because, again, you're playing a reroll comp, but also the 5-costs just aren't that strong for this comp. So, like, it's okay to play Garen and then maybe you can like Cypher mod something, or I don't even know if Cypher mod exists, frankly, but yeah, like, I don't know, the 5-costs just don't end up being all too strong with this. So yeah, just try to play a second Zed if you can. Otherwise, just like look for the Renekton setup that I was mentioning earlier, and yeah, you're good to go. The one thing I will mention on top of that is the Cypher cash outs that are relevant. So unlike your standard Cypher game plan, you're not really going for like a 290 most of the time, just because if you go for a 290, you're going to be losing a little bit too much HP. And if you don't get your 3 stars in time, then you won't be able to leverage the bonus power you get from like a 290 into like a strong enough setup. Most of the time, if you hit like, say this cash out, you can actually find a way to pivot into something else, say like AMP or like Vex or something like that, right? They use similar items. In those cases, like obviously you'd want blue instead, but like sometimes you have blue on your Monk already. So maybe, yeah, it's like sometimes you would just leverage that into a different call. But instead, you actually want to be looking for something like a 250 and a 175, because like these are just like a lot of gold. And we all know that like in reroll comps, like just having a lot of gold is going to be really important. Like say you cash this out, even if without the lesser dupes, a lot of these, you're likely to find at least one Draven or one Galio, sometimes maybe even a couple of these units, just from the lump kind of like reward of all these 3-cost units, right? So you can look for lower level cash outs, like this 12 gold is fine, especially if you cash out early, especially if you don't have, like, you didn't lose too much HP for it. Like these lower level cash outs are completely fine, because once again, you have to recall that you're not getting your stats until your cash out, right? So like you don't have to like really greed for these big cash outs. That being said, in some specific scenarios, which is like something like a hostile takeover, you can actually greed for like a huge cash out. And the reason for that is because hostile takeover takes Cypher and turns it into more of a win streak line. It doesn't actually become a full win streak comp. You can actually still lose and be fine. It's just you get rewarded a lot more by like slamming items and being strong throughout the mid game. So when you have hostile takeover, I would say on 3-2 you're really just rolling for like 4 Cypher plus Echo plus probably like a Bastion or something, and you're just gonna try to win and kill as many units as possible. And then you're going to go to level 7 and you're going to continue rolling. Ideally, eventually you hit Zed. But with hostile takeover, most of the time you're not cashing out on 4-1. You're actually cashing out on like 4-7. In some very, very rare cases, you're cashing out on 5-5. Okay, honestly, I shouldn't even mention that. You're probably not cashing out on 5-5. But yeah, you're most likely going to be cashing out on 4-7. And what that means is that most of the time you're going to be losing a decent amount on stage 4. So you really do want to be winning on stage 2 and 3 to kind of like make up for some of the HP that you're going to be losing later into the game. And then ultimately you're going to be cashing out much bigger than what you would be if you were to play a regular Cypher line. I think on average you should be cashing out like a 350 to 400 with this. Like 350 to 470 probably with hostile takeover. And if we look at some of the 330s, like this is gold. Okay, this 330 actually uniquely is very, very bad, but like 370 ends up being really good, right? Like this is a boatload of gold, a lot of items, a lot of resources, and then if you go up to 450, then you're starting, you're getting your 2-star 5-costs online early, right? And yeah, you're just gonna be really, really happy. Like even something like this ends up being really strong when you're playing around this like new 5 Cypher reroll, just because it gives you a full Z2. And as I mentioned earlier, we want to be playing 2 Zs to begin with, right? So even if, and then like it gives you Banshee's Veil and Night's Vow, which you can actually use on both your Zs, right? And yeah, there's just like, hostile takeover is kind of like its own unique scenario that's like tough to explain unless you've played it yourself, but definitely give it a shot if you can. And yeah, this comp honestly is just really, really fun because of how unique it is. So I think give it a shot. It is not a meme comp, it actually is strong. I've played it a couple times myself. I can definitely verify the power and vouch for the power from having played it. All right, next up we have the first of two Elise main carry comps, and this one's going to be focused around Nitro reroll. So they buffed Nitro, they buffed the Nitro tree like multiple times in the previous patch. They gave Elise a buff, I believe they gave Kindred a buff, they gave Kog'Maw a buff, which is like not exactly a direct buff to Nitro, but because Kog'Maw pairs well with Kindred in the early game, you're gonna see a lot of Kog'Maws like being played on these types of boards. They gave Nitro a buff to the amount of stacks you get for 3 stars. So when you play this comp, you definitely need to have like Nitro on 2-1 or 2-2 or something like that, maybe an Elise drop. But you're going to stack a lot faster once you get your 3 stars, right? And I believe they actually buffed Shyvana as well. Honestly, they buffed this comp so much, and in the patch notes, I believe they said it was like one of the worst performing trees in the entire game. So it makes actually a lot of sense that they buffed it. But yeah, this is going to be your standard, like you just play 4 Nitro and then you play a bunch of Dynamos. Obviously, you always play Bastion with your Shyvana, like the best one being Sedge most of the time. You ultimately get Exotech, and most of the Exotechs don't end up being all too relevant just because like you don't have a backliner to use them. Like it doesn't matter if you get Pulse, Flux, Hollow Bow, and Hyperfangs, just because those items won't really perform on your Jhin. You're not really going for Jhin 3 in this comp. So you generally, like, the EXO really is only relevant if, like, you have a frontline one, Repulsar Lantern, Chassis, and, I mean, Cyber Coil just sucks, but, like, Repulsar Lantern and Chassis specifically end up being pretty valuable. The itemization for this comp, as we saw with, or sorry, as I mentioned earlier in the video, is you're just going to be looking for Blue Buff Gunblade. They buffed Elise from 55 mana total to 50 mana, so Blue Buff ends up being very, very powerful on her. I can't exactly explain to you why Gunblade is BIS on her. It makes sense on Morgana. It makes a little bit less sense on Elise to me. Maybe in this comp it's not BIS, but I know for a fact in the next comp, which is also an Elise comp, it is BIS. But yeah, and then your last item is just going to be your generic damage item. Deathcap and Archangels are going to be the best ones. Giant Slayer's always fine, as per usual. And yeah, I think this comp is a little bit, the situation for playing this comp is a little bit specific just because you really do need that early Nitro to kind of start accruing those stacks. But you also can kind of like approach it from the perspective of some of these augments that kind of like give your Nitro more power. So Polished Chrome is when you 3-star Nitro champions, they gain a certain amount of stats and give you a bunch of gold. This ends up being really powerful because the kind of like the limitation to this comp is the fact that it ends up being really difficult to roll on 5 and 6 for Nidalee, Kindred, and Shyvana 3, then also being able to access Elise 3 later, right? So we've all played games where like we're rolling on 7 for a 3-star 3 cost, and you know we're already having trouble hitting. So in this comp, it's a little bit tough that like I need to roll for Kindred, Nidalee, and Shyvana on like a lower level, and then still also make it to 7, and then roll for Elise on 7, sometimes 8, depending on your spot. But it is going to be tough, and something like a Polished Chrome actually just ends up being really helpful for that, because not only does it give you a lump sum of stats, but that 10 gold per 3-star you hit is going to be really, really valuable. Next, we have Spare Parts. It's just like a similar idea. It's like a Nitro-specific augment, and this just gives you a lot of like early game power. Nitro already is quite strong in the early game, even after the nerfs, so you will probably be winning fights if you have Spare Parts with like a couple of these upgrades. It gives you Shyvana, it doesn't give you Kindred and Nidalee like Polished Chrome does, so maybe it doesn't help you get those early 2-stars to really kind of get win streaking, but it's still really quite valuable just because that extra turret it just ends up doing a lot of damage, honestly. And yeah, this comp is pretty solid. You're just going to start filling it up with more dynamos. Your TX is ultimately going to get very, very big. You want to build Building Redemption. It's fantastic on Shyvana already because Shyvana kind of like increases her max HP. Redemption scales really well with max HP, but also the redemption effect is going to be shared with your T-Hex. And I've actually seen TXs this patch go up to like 350. I believe I saw Soju hit like a 400 T-Hex, which I think it had like 4k. I don't know. It had a lot of HP essentially, and the redemption is just going to be able to keep your TX alive, which ultimately is just going to be more frontline for you, right? The thing with this comp is that, like, even though I talked about how difficult it is to get your early game 3-stars, then still scale into the late game and acquire an Elise 3, it's kind of fine because Elise is, like, so overtuned in the current patch that Elise 1 on stage 2 is a fantastic unit. Like, Elise 1, like, 4 Nitro, 3 Nitro on stage 1 is going to be able to win, or sorry, on stage 2 is going to be able to win you a lot of rounds. And then, actually, Elise 2 is so strong with 3 items that you're actually probably going to be able to win rounds on stage 4 without an Elise 3, right? And that's not going to be something that's all too common with 3-cost reroll. Like, if you guys remember back when Rengar and Jinx was dominating the meta, even though Rengar and Jinx would be like quite strong on stage 3, on stage 4 they can definitely struggle just because, you know, units will be CCing you, like people are getting their 2-star 4 costs, and you can't compete. But this comp actually can compete on stage 4. And the reason for that is, one, Elise 2 is so strong, but you also do have these other 3 stars, or you're at least like nearing them as we approach the later stages of stage 4, right? Like if you have Shyvana 2, or sorry, Shyvana 3, Nidalee 3, and on Elise, Elise 3, or Elise 2, you're actually going to be fairly strong. The least important 3-star for this comp is going to be Kindred, just because you can actually just drop Kindred, like flat out. Like if you're not hitting too many Kindreds, you just have to play 3 Nitro. 4 Nitro isn't all that strong. And in this scenario, you're probably going to be playing around 4 Bastion. So something like a Jax for fixing up your Exotech, as we mentioned earlier. You still end up playing Jhin for Dynamo for most of the game. Sometimes you play Neferi instead. But yeah, you just play 4 Bastion with something like this. So obviously running to compete any Bastion. But something like this, and then we just scale around Aurora and MF. It's tough to itemize MF in this comp because MF is so... The power of MF's ult is so tied to Syndicate that like it's not going to be all too valuable. But, you know, like if you have AD items, it's not going to be like completely fruitless to put items on MF. And you'll probably be fine in that scenario. But yeah, this comp is pretty straightforward. Like it's going to be something that you guys have probably already played before, or at least seen before in a previous patch. It's just they buffed it a decent amount, and it's played. They changed the way it's played a little bit just because of how kind of like relevant Elise is to the comp now. That yeah, I think it's worth mentioning, and I hope you guys have fun playing this comp because honestly, I kind of just like Nitro. It's really fun. All right. Next up, we have the real Elise comp, in my opinion. I know I just kind of like spent, you know, I don't know, 10 minutes talking about this comp. It's not a bad comp, but this is like, this comp is the juice, right? I believe that this is the single best comp in the game. I believe EU thinks this comp is the best in the game. And yeah, I think it's severely underplayed for how good it is. It's just your standard like 3-cost reroll comp in the same way that you guys have seen, you know, Jinx Rengar, or even TF is like, no, I shouldn't mention TF, but like it's very similar to like Jinx Rengar, right? Like you're just playing around a backliner and a frontliner, and you're playing around Braum Elise. You're going to be playing Syndicate around Misfortune, and when you get to level 8, you go for 4 Dynamo. Very basic stuff. You're hatting MF if you have 2-star, and you're hatting Braum once you need more frontline with the Syndicate hat. Same items as before. You probably want Shred and Anti-Heal somewhere, so, you know, obviously we can always just put Shiv and Morello here, and eventually you're going to be playing Aurora anyway, and Aurora is the single best unit in the game to hold these items, so we're going to be very happy when we get her and remove her onto her. So because I kind of like already talked about a lot about like how Elise just like generally functions as a unit in the previous comp, there's not too much to talk about with this comp. It's like you kind of want to look for it when you have an early Elise, because again, Elise 1 is so strong on stage 2 that like when you have that, it's going to be really easy for you to find yourself in a position to look for this comp. I will say there is a little bit of difficulty with this comp right now just because we're seeing more Braums being taken by say like a Twisted Fate. Sometimes they're taking it in Vanguard Marks. There are some times where people will even take it in Zeri MF. It's a little bit more rare, but it does exist. So Braum can be contested, and it will be make it difficult for you to like really have access to your really strong front line, but that's okay. Something to mention, I think I mentioned this last time when I talked about Twisted Fate, but a lot of people just play Rast because I think they're like too attached to this Divinity Core trait. But like if you get Leona 2 is so much stronger than Rast that like, and also like Leo, obviously sometimes like if you're rolling on 7, you actually will just hit a Leona 2 before you have Braum 3. And obviously in that case, we're just going to move all our items onto our Leona until we have Braum 3, right? And that's like pretty simple. And like there are actually cases, I think I actually encountered this case pretty recently where like I have Elise 3 and I have a Leona 2, but like I have like 5 Braums. And in those cases, then you're going to be really happy that you bought all those Leonas because Ras is not going to be able to tank, but Leona is. And yeah. Optimization standard stuff. You don't want to be building Shojin on your Misfortune just because you're playing 4 Dynamo. You don't really need mana. The reason why you build it on Elise is that it is significantly better to have blue buff because it pretty much it reduces your total max mana versus like Shojin is just on hit, on auto attack. And because these units kind of like spend a lot of times on their cast, you don't auto attack that much. But like with blue buff, you don't really have to auto attack, right? So yeah, blue buff on Elise is good. Shojin on these guys end up not being all too powerful. It's not that Shojin's terrible. It's that like tier is obviously very valuable for your Elise items. Tier ends up being really good as a frontline item for your Braum and Leona as well. So it doesn't really make all too much sense to build Shojin. You just want to be building full damage instead. And yeah, this comp is so powerful. I think you don't really need any augments to play it really. I just put Rig Shot because I think this is one of the best augments in the game for 3-cost reroll. Just because on 3-2 when you hit it, you can actually use all 4 of the free rolls to like bolster whatever board you have at the time while still going to 7. And then once you hit 7, the chance that you hit your 3 stars over probably the next stage and maybe stage and a half is going to be like nearly 100% because of how consistent this augment is at being, as just like finding your 3 costs for your 3 cost reroll. Yeah, and there's like not too much else to say with this comp. There's like not really any positioning nuance like there was with some of the other comps, but yeah, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. Leave any feedback you guys have in the comments below. As I said previously, a video focusing on kind of like 4 cost comps and like generalized comps is going to be coming next. I'm not going to be talking about reroll in that video, but yeah, until that comes out, I'll see you next time. Peace.